Vikings had no prisons, just one terrifying alternative. The old man murmured, his breath a ragged ghost curling in the frozen dark. The words did not come as a lesson, but as something heavier, as if torn from the marrow of memory. He stood by the hearth, shoulders stooped, hands blackened with tar and age, staring into the flames as though they were older than gods. Beyond the timber walls, the night pressed close. A long Scandinavian winter night, dense with silence except for the crackle of birchwood and the distant grinding of sea ice on the fjord. The hall smelled of smoke, pine resin, and the sour tang of sweat soaked into the bedding furs. The firelight licked the carved beams, throwing shadows of ships and serpents. A pot of lamb bones and root vegetables simmered low on the embers, the broth thick and greasy. It was not feasting weather. Men were quiet when the wind howled through the rafters, carrying the scent of salt and distant snowstorms. They ate what they had: dried fish softened in water, goat cheese wrapped in ash, flatbread hardened like wood. And when the meal was gone, they listened. Halfdan, the youngest of them, sat cross-legged on the planked floor, gnawing a strip of venison sinew like it might outlast the dark. His eyes, sharp as a fox's, kept flicking to the door, where frost crept along the hinges. He could not remember when the old man, Sigurd, son of no one, had arrived. He only knew that Sigurd's voice carried the weight of truths no skald would sing. "No chains," Sigurd said, his fingers curling over the rim of his carved drinking bowl. "A man who breaks the law is not kept. He is broken. The land swallows him. Or worse." A log shifted in the fire, sending sparks up like angry spirits. Outside, something moaned. The wind, or maybe the thin scream of an ice fox. Halfdan's jaw tightened. He thought of the men who had not returned from the last raiding season, not because of a storm, but because they had walked too far into the white forests where the Byamians lived. The Byamians. A name spoken with half a sneer, half a prayer. They were said to have no halls, no kings, no runestones, only snow-buried huts and strange ways that bent the will of stronger men. No Viking spoke of them easily. Sigurd's eyes glimmered. They take what binds a man, his breath, his blood, his name, and turn it against him. We thought them ghosts. They were not ghosts, just people who knew the land better than we ever would. He paused to sip from his bowl, and the bitter steam of herb beer filled the air. Bog myrtle, yarrow, and a hint of smoke-dried juniper. They did not need walls to hold you. Their punishment was the land itself. The others shifted uneasily. Jarl Erik, broad-shouldered and scarred from 20 winters of raiding, leaned forward, his elbows creaking against the table. "Speak plain, old man." "What did you see?" Sigurd smiled thinly, like a man whose teeth ache in the cold. "You do not want to see it," he said. "But you will, because the winter will drive us north, and the north is theirs." Halfdan swallowed hard. The fire hissed as fat dripped from the bone pot, and the air grew heavy, as if even the smoke wished to listen. Eric's wife, Signa, moved silently through the hall, her hands smelling of tallow and nettle soap. She set new rushlights in the wall sconces, their flames bending against the draft. She did not meet Sigurd's gaze. Women understood fear differently, not as battle, but as silence. Outside, the snow deepened. The fjord froze at its edges, and the world narrowed to a circle of light around the fire. Sigurd began to speak, and his voice carried the weight of a saga uncarved in stone. He told them of the Byamians' forests, where skis made no sound and every tree might hide a spear. Of hunters who painted their faces with ash and bone dust, moving like shadows between birch trunks. He told them of men taken not for ransom, but for judgment. Stripped, staked, and left for the forest to claim. They say the snow itself is their weapon, Sigurd whispered, leaning closer, his breath damp on the wooden rim of the table. It blinds you. It buries you alive. The Biamians need no iron to hold you. The land does that for them. Halfdan shivered, though the fire burned hot. He thought of the stories he'd overheard in the longhouses, of mummified ancestors standing guard over the forests, wrapped in birch bark and frozen stiff, their hollow eyes watching the living. He did not believe them, but he also did not want to test them. The hall fell silent. Outside, the night was a living thing, breathing slow and cold against the walls. Eric straightened, his shadow long across the floor. "Tomorrow we test the ice roads," he said. "If the Biamians watch us, let them watch. We are not afraid." Sigurd said nothing. He only stared into the fire, as if he knew that fear was not a choice. And somewhere beyond the fjord, a sound rose. A low hum, too steady to be wind, too soft to be a horn. It grew, pulsing through the frozen ground like something alive. Halfdan's breath caught, and every man in the hall turned toward the door. The sound did not stop. It was getting closer. The sound did not stop. It came low, like a distant drum muffled by snow, then changed, not louder, but closer. Rhythmic, purposeful, not wind, not animal, something else. Halfdan stood, too fast, his knee cracked. The others rose slower, men bred not for panic, but for caution. Sina had already vanished into the shadows behind the weaving loom, where her shears hung like a priest's blade. Only Sigurd did not move, his gaze fixed not on the door, but the ceiling above the hearth, where the rafters creaked under the weight of snow. He was listening to something behind the sound. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was worse. Outside, the darkness pressed close. The world held its breath. Jarl Erik crossed the hall and flung the door open with a grunt. Cold air punched inward, bringing with it a swirl of snow and the stink of wet pine. The yard was empty. The sled dogs barked once and fell quiet, ears flat. The wind had died. The moon was buried in cloud. Nothing moved beyond the woven fence but the black verticals of pine trunks, stretching like spears into the hills. They listened. Nothing. Just the heavy silence that followed something important. And then they saw it. Not a man, not a beast, a mark, pressed into the snow just beyond the firewood stack. A shape too clean for wind, too purposeful for chance. A boot print, but wrong. Broader at the toe, narrow at the heel. Not one of theirs. Laced tight with hide cord. Biamian. Sigurd's voice broke the hush like a whisper of ice through birch leaves. "They've come." Eric stepped outside, eyes raking the tree line. "How close?" Sigurd didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, no one slept. They sealed the door with iron nails hammered through wooden beams. They stuffed sheep's wool into the wall seams. Sina lit a braid of dried mugwort and blew smoke into every corner. Halfdan and Eirik dragged the heavy table across the threshold. It wasn't fear. It was old instinct. Men who lived where winter ruled knew the weight of quiet like this. No one spoke of dreams. But when dawn came, gray and thick as boiled oats, no man in the longhouse looked rested. They left the hall without eating. Cold hardened their boots. The air smelled of moss and wet charcoal. The dogs had pissed themselves. One had chewed halfway through its leather tether. Another had vanished. The forest waited. 3 men went to scout the rise above the fjord. Eirik, Halfdan, and a thrall named Arngir, who had once survived a winter in Finnmark. They took no banner, no noise, only axes. The snow was dry and packed in sheets, crusted from a midnight freeze. Each step cracked like bones under a cartwheel. Halfdan moved last, his shoulder still sore from an old fight. He watched the tree line as though it were breathing. Every now and then he swore he saw something. A flicker of ash-white movement between the dark trees. But when he stopped, there was nothing. He said nothing. At the ridge, they saw the first shape. At first, it looked like a hunting post. A wooden scaffold about 2 ells tall, lashed with rawhide. But the air around it stank of rot, and a cluster of gray feathers fluttered on sharpened birch poles stabbed into the ground in a ring. In the center stood a man, or what had once been a man. He was stripped to the waist, skin blackened with frost and blood, arms splayed outward and nailed into the wooden frame with iron pegs through the forearms. Not sagging, posed. His head was bent downward, chin to chest, and snow had crusted on his shoulders like a cloak. Not a Viking, a Biamian. His face was hidden beneath a mask carved from birch bark and painted with ochre in 2 wide staring eyes and a stretched, round mouth. Open, in silence. Goat hair was threaded into the bark to mimic a beard. Animal ribs, whitened and polished, were hung like wind chimes from his elbows, swaying gently even in still air. Halfdan's stomach knotted. He'd seen the dead, many times. But this was something else. Not a warning. A message. Eric stood still. Why show us their own? Not theirs anymore, Arngir murmured. A watcher, to test if we're still men. They turned back, slower now. The woods felt denser, colder. Behind them, the rib bells rang soft in the windless air. Back at the longhouse, Sina had already boiled fish bones and rowan bark into a thick tea. No one asked where she learned it. Her mother had been a midwife in the mountains, one who knew things that didn't pass through runes. They drank. No one said the word curse, but it moved between them like a smell. Sigurd hadn't moved. He sat wrapped in reindeer hide near the hearth, watching the door as if it might speak. They do not fight to win, he said after a long silence. They fight to dissolve you, make your arms heavy, make your mind turn on itself. Madness, Eric said, still holding his axe. Fear magic. No magic, Sigurd replied. Only understanding. The next morning, the first man vanished. It was Torsten the thick-necked, a smith whose cough kept men awake and whose snore could drown a storm. He had gone to the latrine trench before dawn. The snow bore no struggle, no blood. Just his tracks out, none back. Sina found his belt hung from the yew tree. Not broken, untied, braided into a knot like those carved into old stones. A serpent biting itself. By midday, the wind returned. It came in gusts from the north, sharp with pine, and the faint smell of lichen burned in snow. No fire stayed lit. The men brought in the dogs. They nailed the shutters closed. And then came the sound again. Not from the tree line this time, from beneath. A thumping, slow, measured, like fists beating on hollow ground. Halfdan dropped his ladle. Broth splashed down the front of his tunic. No one moved. The hearth crackled. Outside, no footstep fell. But the thump came again. And again. Closer. The men stared at the floor. Arngir rose first. He lifted the rug of elk hide and knelt beside the trapdoor, a slat covering the root cellar where dried cod, salted lamb, and barley sacks hung from poles. He pressed his ear to the wood. Eyes wide. They're beneath, he whispered. Eric crossed the room, silent. His boots didn't creak. He pulled his axe. Wait, Sigurd said low. They don't enter. They don't need to. That sound is not meant for us. Eric didn't look away. Then who? Sigurd's eyes drifted to the rafters again. Outside, the thumping ceased. But the fear remained, thick as the smoke that refused to rise. The air hung low. Breaths came shallow. The soup curdled. That night, the Biamians left another gift. At dawn, Sina opened the shutters to toss out the ash pan. She stopped, screamed. Hung from the porch beam by deer sinew was a doll, made of sticks and wrapped in human hair, its eyes hollowed chicken bones, its mouth smeared with blood and something darker. The men burned it. But they burned it wrong. They tossed it into the hearth with steel tongs. And when the fire hissed, it hissed back. That night, no man left the hall. They pissed in buckets. They slept with blades. They turned the dogs loose in the yard, but they did not bark. Halfdan didn't sleep. He lay stiff in his bedding of sheepskin and hay, watching the fire fade to embers. He thought of the first words Sigurd had spoken and how they had changed shape in his mind. Vikings had no prisons, just one terrifying alternative. And now he knew. The prison was this: the waiting, the silence, the inversion of power, the cold whisper of judgment from people who did not kill for gold, or land, or vengeance, but to see if you could bear it. And in the forest beyond, unseen but not absent, the Bohemians waited. Not for battle, for unraveling. The fire had gone out, not in a rush of wind or splash of snow, but in silence. A slow, sick extinguishing, as though it died of some deep weariness. Halfdan woke with his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. His breath clouded faintly above his face. The hearth, mere shadow. Around him, the hall lay cloaked in gray pre-dawn stillness. The air smelled wrong, not foul, empty. He sat up slowly, blanket falling from his shoulders. The hide beneath him was cold and damp. A faint layer of frost clung to the beam above his head. Someone had opened the door. No sound of wind, no dogs. He reached for the knife beneath his bedroll. Not the axe. The axe was for men. The knife was for things that moved in silence. He padded barefoot toward the door, each plank stiff with cold. The others still lay in their beds. Or what looked like them. One shape had not moved since the night before. He dared not count them. The door stood open by a hand's width. Snow had drifted inside. But there were no footprints. Only one trail. Not into the forest, but across the roof, where something light had crept in through the smoke hole and perhaps never left. That day they found Gorm. He'd hung himself in the goat pen. A thick rope of bramblevine twisted 3 times around his neck, anchored not to the beam, but to a standing stone behind the stable. One no one had seen before. A stone carved with a face. The eyes were slits. The mouth a long open oval. Not Norse, not Roman, not animal. They buried Gorm in silence. No rites, no mead. Not because they lacked the will, but because the ground would not open. The frost had crept deeper than iron. Eirik ordered the corpse lashed to a sled and dragged it half a league to the riverbank, where the ice was thin enough to break. Halfdan did not go. That night he dreamed of the rafters. Not as wood, but as ribs, and something breathing inside the ceiling, slow and patient. He told no one. He sharpened his knife and listened to the wind. On the 3rd day, Eirik vanished. They found his boots still warm by the hearth, his cloak folded, his axe on the bench. The door had not opened. The dogs had not barked. Only his drinking horn was missing. And beside it, someone had carved a symbol into the floor. Not with a knife, but a hot iron. The wood had bubbled and blackened, forming a coil of 3 spirals intersecting at a hollow point. Sigurd knew it. A shame knot, he whispered. Used by the Sami before they name their dead. But Eirik's not dead, said Halfdan. Sigurd only looked at the roof. That night it snowed. Not a storm. A veil. The kind of snow that dulls sound and buries the world in a hush. The longhouse groaned under the weight. The shutters swelled and cracked. The fire would not stay lit. Men began to whisper. Signa caught them, Arngir and 2 others, feeding strips of dried goat liver to the hearth, chanting something not in Norse. Not in any tongue she knew. She struck them with the bellows and called for Sigurd, who did not scold them. He only asked what they'd seen. One said he saw Eric outside, standing naked in the yard, weeping blood from empty sockets. The other claimed to have spoken with Gorm beneath the table, who warned him not to drink the tea. Sigurd didn't laugh. He rubbed his fingers with ash and smeared it across their brows. Then he told them to lie on their backs and look at the beams above. Not for an hour, but until their eyes stopped twitching. "Madness comes sideways," he muttered. "You must not follow it. Let it pass." They obeyed. But Arngir's lips moved long after the others slept. The words were not prayers. They were counting. The fourth night, the forest spoke. Not with voice or drum, but shape. Sina was the first to see it. Before dawn, through the frost-glazed shutter, 4 black lines, high in the trees, strung between trunks like rope. At first she thought they were vines. Then they moved. Arms, human. 4 pairs, strung high, swinging faintly. No blood, no heads. By the time Halfdan reached the tree line, they were gone. No tracks, no ropes, only small holes in the snow where wooden stilts had stood. Not a warning, a display, like antlers on a barn wall. That evening, no one spoke. They chewed raw lichen soaked in milk, drank nothing. They wrapped their heads in fur to muffle the hum they now heard each night. A pulse from the ground, like a slow drum beaten with breath. Halfdan tried to speak to Sina once, to ask if she'd known Eric was gone before it happened. But she looked through him like she was listening to something louder. The hallucinations did not come in color. They came in texture. Frost that moved against the grain, shadows shaped like teeth. Halfdan watched his own fingers move in the wrong order, his left eye showing him 2 seconds behind the right. He saw faces in the smoke. He saw Eric's mouth open and spiders pour out. He whispered his father's name into the ash. No answer. Sigurd spoke less each day. He traced knots in the timber with his nails until they bled. His fingernails peeled like bark. He said nothing. By the 6th day, the Biamians entered. Not as men. One night, the hall filled with smoke. But there was no fire. Thick, sweet, cloying. The smell of burned birch resin, crushed mushrooms, and boiled reindeer fat. The air shimmered. Then came the sounds. Antlers scraping the beams, feathers brushing the floor, breathing in the corners where no one sat. Halfdan gripped his knife and sat in the ash pit. He could not feel his legs. He heard a girl singing in the roof. She sang in a tongue he knew, but not from this life. He wept without knowing. That dawn, the dogs were inside, but they had no eyes. Not torn. Removed. Each socket cleaned with precision. The animals did not whimper. They lay quiet, as if ashamed. Sina covered them in wool and wept into their fur. Sigurd took one of the sockets and filled it with snow. "Nothing melts here," he said. That evening, a single arrow landed on the roof. No sound, no flight. It was birchwood, fletched with swan feather and etched with runes not of their tongue. They left it where it fell. By the 9th day, only 4 remained. Signa, Halfdan, Sigurd, Arngir. Arngir did not eat. He hung moss in the corners. He whispered to the kettle. He said the Biamians had shown him their dead. Mummified elders strung high in birch groves, staring southward. He said one had smiled. Sina boiled spruce tips and bone. She burned goat fat and sang lullabies in Sami cadences. She carried her knife not in hand, but in her mouth. Teeth clenched to remind her of living. Sigurd no longer blinked. He stared through the floor. Halfdan kept the door open now. He wanted to see what came. But nothing came. Then the girl arrived. Not a child, not a woman. Wrapped in bark, face painted in ash and lichen, barefoot, eyes milk white. She stood at the tree line until someone noticed. Then she vanished. They did not follow. Not that day. But that night, Halfdan heard her whisper. She spoke in Biamian, but he understood. "You are in the hollow now," she said, "where men are not measured by blade, but by silence." And then Arngir smiled, and walked into the snow, and left no prints. At first it looked like a procession of stags. Through the snow-heavy mist, the figures emerged in single file. Tall, narrow silhouettes with antlers rising from their heads, bodies cloaked in shaggy white fur that moved without sound. The mist did not part for them. It drew in closer, as if ashamed of the footprints left in its wake. Halfdan saw them from the roof. He had climbed there after dawn, not out of defiance, but necessity. The inside of the hall had begun to feel like a cave of ghosts, and the smoke no longer rose from the hearth. His breath curled in shallow clouds as he lay flat on his stomach, face pressed to cold wood, frost eating at his lashes. The figures advanced slowly, as if the distance between them and the longhouse was not of miles, but of meaning, a ritual to be walked, not merely crossed. One of them stopped. Halfdan blinked. He did not move. From behind her mask, white birch, long nose, no mouth, the woman tilted her head, slowly, as though listening to the bones inside her own neck. He knew it was a woman. Not because of her size. She was nearly his height, broad-shouldered, wrapped in reindeer hide so thick it hid her shape, but because of how the others moved around her. 3 others. They hung back slightly, waiting for her signal. One knelt and scattered a handful of ash into the snow. Another lifted a bone rattle and shook it once, not rhythmically, but like the end of a sentence. They all wore antlers, but hers were larger, gnarled like the roots of a mountain yew. Priestess. Sigurd, long ago, had whispered that the Biamians did not distinguish between war and ritual, or priestess and commander. Their generals were shamans, their weapons were rites. And when they killed, they sang. Halfdan watched them approach the goat pen, or what was left of it. They stopped 5 paces short. The one with the ash turned and drew a spiral in the snow. The one with the rattle bent her knees and began a slow, swaying movement, as if dancing in water. Her hands curled in and out, like fingers weaving something invisible. The leader watched the house, watched him. Her antlers caught the pale winter sun. No eyes were visible behind the mask, but he felt them, heavy as stones in the chest. Sina had come to the roof silently. She knelt beside him now, her breath barely stirring the air. "Do you see it?" Halfdan murmured. "I see her," Sina said. "Is she looking at me?" "She's looking through you," Sina replied. "You're not the one she came for." Halfdan swallowed. In the yard, the woman turned her head slowly, scanning the house as though remembering it. She stepped forward. 1 step only. Sina tensed. "They're testing us," she whispered, "seeing if we'll respond as men." "How else would we respond?" "Not as men." The rattle woman began to hum, low, a note that vibrated in the gut rather than the ear. Halfdan reached for the throwing axe he had kept tucked beneath a bundle of dried cod skins. His fingers were stiff. Sina grabbed his wrist. "If you throw it, you've answered wrong. They're enemies. They're judges." The hum deepened. The ash spiral began to smoke, not burn. A fragrant, sickly sweetness filled the air. Bog myrtle, crushed spruce needles, rendered seal fat. Then the priestess raised her hand and pointed, not at Halfdan, at the longhouse door. Sigurd opened it. He stood without cloak, barefoot in the snow. His skin, gray-blue with chill, looked ashen beneath his beard. His eyes no longer blinked. He said nothing. The priestess stepped forward. She did not touch him. She turned and walked. He followed, not like a captive, like a servant. No one moved to stop him. Sina exhaled and lowered her hands. The breath left her like the end of a spell. Halfdan knelt there, stunned, his body not yet understanding what had passed. She came for him, Sina said. She took him. She didn't take, he gave. They watched the shapes disappear into the white forest. That night, Halfdan did not sleep, nor did Sina. They spoke no words. At some point in the middle of the night, Sina lit a lamp of seal oil and boiled dried lichen and fish spine into a thick tea. She added something Halfdan did not recognize. Small black berries strung on a cord around her wrist. "Do I drink it?" he asked. "No, you chew. One side of the mouth only." She bit hers on the right. He mirrored. The bitterness crawled up his jaw like fire ants. Then came silence. But it was not silence. It was a muffling, as if sound still moved, but slower, wrapped in cotton. Then the feeling came. Not dizziness. A centering. As if all his bones realigned towards something beneath the floor. They sat cross-legged in the hearth pit, eye to eye. "Do you see her now?" Signa asked. He didn't need to ask who. He nodded. Behind her, in the smoke, stood the mask. White bark, root horns, eyes hollow. And behind it, smaller shapes. Children with soot-smeared cheeks and wolf pelts. A man with blue teeth. A dog with a human face. "She's not a witch," Sina said. "She's what happens when men forget how to be still." He did not understand, but he said nothing. That was the first lesson. At dawn, they followed. Not like warriors, not armed. Sina took only a knife of whalebone. Halfdan wore no iron. They walked into the white forest, past the goat pen, over the ash spiral now filled with ice. They walked for hours. The snow did not cling to them. The trees thinned. The sound of wind changed. It no longer howled. It chanted. They passed through a glade where bones hung from the trees, not as trophies, but as bells. Femurs, ribs, jawbones, all strung with sinew, wrapped in moss to dampen the sound. As they moved, the bones shifted, letting out long, humming sighs like breath escaping a dying man. They did not stop. Eventually, they came to the grove. It was not a camp. It was a sanctuary. Huts made from birch bark and sod, half buried in snow. A ring of standing stones, each carved with inward-facing figures. Not gods, but women. Wide-hipped, faceless. Their arms folded across empty wombs. In the center stood the mummified. 7 of them. Bodies wrapped in woven reeds, dressed in ceremonial skins. Faces painted black with soot and blood. Eyes left open, not rotted, but crystallized by frost. They stood upright, lashed to poles, heads tilted toward the south. Sina stopped. "These are the Watchers," she said. "They do not sleep. They do not rot. They remember." "Remember what?" Halfdan asked. "When the North had no kings, only women who bled into the earth and walked away stronger." He did not speak. From between the mummies stepped a girl, the same girl, milk-eyed, barefoot, bark-wrapped. She smiled, not sweetly, not cruelly, like a mirror. Then she gestured, palm upward, toward the stones. Sina stepped forward. Halfdan followed. They knelt. The girl placed a hand on Sina's head, then on his. The hand was warm. And then came the sound. Not voice, not music. a vibration that passed through bone, not ear, a memory of womb and wolf and woman and winter. He closed his eyes. He saw ships burning, not from fire, from shame. He saw men kneeling before women who did not speak, only watched. He saw his own face, mouth sewn shut, weeping not from pain but from the unbearable release of silence. When he opened his eyes, the grove was empty. No mummies, no girl. Only snow, and Sina, holding his hand. "We are not prisoners," she whispered. "No," he said. "We were the ones kept out, not them kept in." When they returned to the longhouse, it had collapsed. Not from battle, from abandonment. The roof had caved under snow, the walls had rotted, the dogs were gone. A single object remained in the ash pit, Sigurd's horn, filled with pine pitch and bound in hair. A message, not of defeat, of transformation. They did not rebuild. They did not leave. They stayed and waited, because the Byamians were not hunters. They were trials, and trial does not end until the soul chooses to rise. The trees did not move, but the snow beneath them swirled, as if something had walked through moments before. Halfdan knew that pattern now. The hollow silence that trailed behind the Byamians. The absence of noise was never stillness. It was orchestration. He crouched beside the ridge of the ravine, where the land broke into a shallow basin of frozen willow and tangled alder. He did not know how many days had passed since they returned to the longhouse ruins. Signa no longer marked them. There was no reason to. He did not know if he was scouting or being watched. The difference was no longer meaningful. The forest itself was alive with judgment, not malevolent, not kind, merely observant. He heard it first. Not footsteps. A breath. Then the crack of fire, not wood, but pitch, hot, black, sudden. Smoke rose, from nowhere. It poured like a living thing from the base of the trees to the east, curling along the snow, hugging the ground, not upward, not toward the sky. It moved like water, controlled, trained. Sina's voice in his head. If the smoke moves against the wind, you are inside a right. He dropped flat into the snow. His heartbeat quickened, but he did not run. Running was response, and response was failure. The smoke reached him. It smelled not of destruction, but of history. Birch sap, reindeer milk fat, dried blood, charred moss. It clung to the inside of his nose like a memory of warmth long extinguished. He closed his eyes, and the performance began. The first drum sounded low, not from any direction, but through the ground. A pulse. Then the second, higher, tighter, like bone against stretched hide. A rhythm built, irregular, layered, not warlike, ceremonial. A sequence without repetition. Then came the dancers. They emerged from the mist in pairs, moving along the ridge above the ravine. Each one bore a mask, long snouts of bark, soot-lined teeth, feathered antlers rising from their foreheads. They wore no armor, only layered cloaks of fur and bark, embroidered with what looked like bone beads. But the beads shifted in the smoke. Faces, eyes, fingers. Their movements were precise. Not fluid like skaldic dance, but broken. Halts, jerks, twists, like a marionette remembering its own muscles. They did not mimic animals. They mimicked the memory of being hunted. Halfdan watched, breath shallow. He felt no fear, not the kind he had known in war. This was different. Aw's cousin, something raw that told the bones to listen even when the ears could not. Then came the archers. He did not see them, only the arrows, not in flight, in arrival. The first arrow struck 3 paces in front of him, tip embedded in the snow, shaft upright, feathers painted red. The second landed behind him. White feathers, then a third to his left. Black. A triangle. He understood. Not attack. Enclosure. He was in their scene now. A woman stepped forward from the tree line, taller than the others, her mask divided in two. One half red, one white. Her antlers were carved from wood, smoothed and shaped into spirals. She carried a staff made from an elk spine, the vertebrae bound with sinew and adorned with small bells made of bronze and tooth. She did not walk. She entered, like an actor crossing the sacred line into a story that had already been told but needed to be lived again. She raised the staff. The drums stopped. The smoke halted. And then she pointed, not at Halfdan, at a shape behind him. He turned. Sina. She was kneeling in the center of the arrow triangle. She had followed. He had not seen her. She rose slowly, her shoulders squared. Her eyes met the priestess's. And then, without signal, she moved. Into the dance. Not imitation. Participation. Her steps were slow, deliberate, matching the cadence that had stopped. But the moment she moved, the drumming resumed. Different this time. Echoing her. She turned once, slowly, bent her knees, spun on her heel. Then the others joined. 4 Biamians moved in a circle around her, weaving in and out, never touching, their heads low, antlers crossing in intricate patterns like the interlaced dragons on Viking woodwork. It was not battle. It was invocation. Halfdan understood nothing. And everything. Sina was no longer his kin, not his companion. She was the focal point, a hinge upon which the story turned. Not captive, not convert, vessel. She reached into her tunic and drew out something small, a piece of cloth. Red. She knelt. She buried it in the snow. The drums stopped. All movement ceased. The smoke lifted. The performers stepped back, one by one, vanishing behind the trees like breath into frost. Only Sina remained. She stood slowly. Her shoulders shook, not from cold. She turned to Halfdan. Her eyes did not focus. She gave him back, she whispered. Halfdan stood. Who? Signa looked past him, and Sigurd stepped from the trees. He was thinner, paler. His beard had grown long and matted with grease, but he walked upright, not chained, not driven. He carried no weapons, only a pouch made of sealskin stitched with bone needles into a knot pattern Halfdan had never seen. He knelt before Sina and offered it. She took it, opened it. Inside, a single tooth. Large, human, flattened by time, stained with ash. She closed the pouch. What does it mean? Halfdan asked. Sina looked at him. She took his shame. In return, he carries her silence. Sigurd bowed his head, then turned, and walked back into the trees. No one followed. They returned to the longhouse ruins. The snow had melted from the doorframe. The hearth was dry. Inside, a pile of birch bark had been left where the fire pit once stood. Sina knelt, read them, not words, symbols, a spiral, a handprint, a woman's hips, a closed eye. She laid the pouch beside it, then lit the bark. The flame caught fast, bright, white, odorless, then it turned blue, then gone. Ash without smoke. Halfdan did not speak for 3 days. Signa wove bark into thread. Neither asked questions. On the 4th day, they found the remains. A small party of Norsemen, 5 or 6, bones broken, eyes missing, laid out in a circle. At the center, an arrow, fletched with gold leaf. The bodies were not looted. Their weapons remained. But every blade was bent. Halfdan bent down, picked up a broken axe. On the shaft, someone had carved a symbol, deeply, with intent. A spiral. Inside it, a dot. The Watcher's mark. Sina turned to him. They never strike from fear, she said. Only from memory. He nodded. They do not war. No, they correct. The sky grew dark with snow again, but he no longer feared it. They turned toward the path that led north, not to return, but to witness. Because the next theater would not be theirs. And the silence had only just begun. The fjord thawed before the snow had fully melted. No one spoke of it, but old women noticed. They stirred their fish stew slower, watching the waterline with eyes that remembered tides not written down. The ice that once shattered with groans and bursts now vanished quietly, as though it had been summoned away. In one village, so small it had no name beyond what the fishermen called the bend in the rocks, a man came walking from the white north. He was lean, wrapped in wolf fur that stank of pine pitch and iron bark. His hair was cropped short, but his beard fell to the breastbone, braided with 3 small bones, one long, one flat, one sharpened to a point. His right eye was clouded, not blind, just turned inward. They asked him where he had come from. He didn't answer. He knelt beside the hearth in the house of the old Jarl's widow and drew a spiral in the ash with a stick of charred pine. She nodded and gave him salted herring and a bed of straw. The stories began there, as they often did, not with scalds, but with widows. They said he had come from the white forest, where trees drank sound and the air remembered every footstep. They said he had walked among the watchers, the ones whose eyes never closed, and that he had not been taken. He had been spared, which was worse. They asked him what he had seen. He said only this: "There are no prisons in the north, only eyes, and they are patient." Children began to draw circles in the dirt, not for games, for protection. 3 spirals curled inward, surrounded by dots, the watcher's mark. Old warriors flinched when they saw it. Some threw stones, some covered their own shields with it. No one agreed what it meant, but everyone agreed not to speak of it at night. In Uppsala, a trader brought a pouch of rare ivory from the far north. Carved into the side of each tusk were scenes unlike any known saga. A figure kneeling in the snow. Surrounding it, women with antlers, their hands raised not in prayer, in silence. The priest of Odin who purchased them refused to display them in the temple. He hid them beneath his bed. He died 3 winters later in his sleep, mouth open, eyes bloodless. His apprentice burned the tusks, but the carvings remained in the ash. In Iceland, a poet wrote a riddle. What walks on frost without sound, whispers through snow without breath, and leaves a mark where no foot falls? The answer was never given, but the riddle spread. Some tried to follow the path north. Scalds, outlaws, madmen, a bishop's bastard son. None returned, except one woman, a weaver from Trondheim who had lost 3 sons in raiding. She had walked into the forest with a braid of her own hair wrapped around a spindle. She returned months later, with no voice. Only her hands moved, weaving patterns no one had seen before. Spirals, eyes, antlers. Her cloth fetched 10 times its weight in salt. But she never sold it. She laid it over her sons' graves and slept by the stones. Others whispered of a market, held once every 3 winters, north of the pine line. West of the ice caves, where men and women stood in silence beside furs and bone medicine, where you did not speak the price. You gave something of equal pain. A tooth for a bear claw, a grief for a salve, a secret for safe passage. They said the Byamians traded there, in daylight, with no masks, but no Viking ever claimed to have looked them in the eye. In Bergen, a woman who once sailed with her husband on his last raid told a tale. She said the gods had lost their grip on the white north, that Freya's voice had once tried to tame the woods, but the trees had no use for love or war. Only memory. And the Byamians were that memory, walking. By the 10th winter, the stories had names. The Watchers, the Spiral Women, the North Judges, Some said they were not human. Others insisted they were more human than we had ever been allowed to become. The old Jarl's widow, now half-blind and bedbound, said it best: "We raised our boys to conquer, but some land doesn't want to be conquered. It wants to hold a mirror and make you kneel before what you see." Halfdan never spoke again in the villages, but he became a name, a caution. Some said he wandered the coastlines, watching the children who carved spirals in driftwood. Others claimed he lived in the cliffs above the White Forest, lighting fires every solstice to remind the Byamians he had not forgotten. Sina was never seen again. But midwives in the north began to sing new songs during birth. Songs without words, only rhythms. Slow, broken, lurching. They were called the unweaving, and babies calmed when they heard them. In later years, when Viking raids reached new lands, farther south where stone towers stood, some warriors painted symbols on their shields not of Thor or wolves or axes. They painted a single eye, surrounded by snowflakes. The Saxons feared it, because men who bore that mark did not scream when they died. They smiled. One spring, a skald laid a poem at the foot of a runestone outside Kalmar. He was never paid, but the poem remained, carved by another hand. It read, "We sailed with blood, but walked back with silence. The forest took our war and gave us ourselves. We were not ready, but we were seen. And in the white forest, where the snow never truly melted and the roots drank deeper than iron, 7 figures stood in a ring, not mummified, alive, wrapped in birch and stillness, eyes open, watching south, forever."